In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, grant us concentration, that we may learn, listen, understand, have a peaceful mind, and remember that you're with us always. Amen. In this video, we're going to begin our discussion of population ecology. And so just like with population genetics, we want to begin by discussing what do we mean by a population. And I think you'll see as we talk about population in the sense of ecology, it's a little different than our definition of population as it related to genetics and the flow of information. So we begin with this definition. What is a population? Well, we're going to say a population is one species that occupies a particular area. And we're going to take apart these two different parts and begin to look at a better understanding of how this relates to the population ecology. So we're looking at one species. So in this case, again, similar to our definition of population in the genetic sense, is these are going to be individuals which share genetic information, one species. And so this species, however, we can also consider as having a particular role in the environment. And we're going to talk a lot about that role or that particular function that the population has. The second part of this definition is occupies a particular area. As we'll see, we're going to refer to this as a population range. Because of the definition of it being a particular area, the definition of a population in this case may be very small, very narrow, or it may be extremely broad. So I give you three examples here. If we're using human population, we could talk about the human population in the world. We could talk about the human population in the United States, or in Western Pennsylvania, or Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. So wherever we're defining that, that's going to define from very narrow to very broad. So our definition of the area when we study population becomes very important. We may also be very, very specific and refer to the gut or the intestinal bacterial population of an individual, sometimes referred to as the microbiome of an individual. And so this, again, very narrow definition. We could expand that and say the microbiome of all individuals that are currently taking a ketogenic diet. Now, it's a little bit broader, and there will be some variation based on location. The final way we can look at this would be connection to the ecosystem in which they evolve. Rather than defining this based on geographic area, we may look at the population of deer in a forest, in a particular forest, which may overlap different geographic boundaries. The Appalachian forest. Okay. What is the deer population like in that area? Or we may say the population of deer in a deciduous forest. Okay, so that would be a little bit broader. So the definition of the population is going to really be defined based on those different criteria. Now, when we talk about these population ranges, it's important to note that this is the area, geographic area, occupied by the species that we're interested in. And it's going to show the interaction with other species in the area. Again, that's a little more into the community ecology. So we're showing some connections here already. So this area may be very small, may be very large. And another important, it's not static. It may change over time. So the example that I would use for that change over time, is the example of polar bears. Polar bears live in the Arctic region. As a result of climate change over the last few years, their geographic area has been changing. And so these changes can be noted, and the patterns of the population will change over time. So when we're talking about a particular species, the population range is not static. Within a given population range, we're going to see that different species will occupy the area differently. And we have 3 different demonstrated dispersal patterns, or how the species are going to be spread through that area. I always like to start backwards and start with C, which is random. Okay, so some species, such as our dandelions here, are species that do not strongly interact with each other, and they don't, or with the individuals, and therefore don't have a specific area or a pattern that can be discerned within that population area. So they're just basically randomly. Wherever the plant dandelions grow is where they grow. The second one is a uniform. And the uniform dispersal, shown here by our hawks, or our birds of prey, in this case, the interaction between the individual will result from competition for a common resource, food or water. And because of this, the organism will defend its area. And so that leads to an even dispersal throughout the population. And so we're showing the example here with the hawks. An example in plants would be what we talked about with allelopathy. And allelopathy is where the black walnut, as an example, spreads out toxins that prevent the germination of seeds near its roots. Because of that, it's sort of defending its area, and it results in a sort of more even distribution of the plants within that area. So that gives you another example of that. The final one is clumped. Okay? And clumped distribution results in an unequal distribution of resources in the population, or from social interactions among the individuals. And the example we have here is a herding animal, elephants, in which the adults, at least the females, will remain together throughout the year to assist each other in raising their young. And so that social interaction results in clumped distribution. So if we're looking at another example, let's talk about limited resource. You know, they always say that the grass is greener over the septic tank. Why is the grass greener over the septic tank? Because there's a lot of rich nutrients that are in the soil in that area, and so plants will have a tendency to clump near that area because of the resources. So it's not an even distribution, but there's going to be areas where we see more growth, areas where we see less growth. Another example that always comes to mind when I think about clump distribution are oases. So an oasis is an area in a desert where there's a water source available. Because the water in this case is a limiting resource in the very arid climate, plants and animals tend to sort of clump around the water area and grow in that way. So the clump distribution shows uneven. And so within the population, animals or plants, organisms will tend to take up one or the other of these dispersal patterns. Again, this may affect the population range and where the animal is living. As I mentioned, and we will talk about this in some detail, is that populations have a tendency to change over time, whether we talk about the range, changes in nutrients, changes in conditions, but it may also be the result of interactions between the different predators. Okay? The study of this is referred to as demographics. And so demographics is a quantitative study of populations that show the change in the population over time, how the numbers of individuals are changing, how the different individuals, ages of the individuals present in the population changes over time. Sort of a subclass of demographics is dynamics. Okay? And so dynamics, we could say, is considering the actual processes that are involved in the change over time. Okay? What is changing about the environment or the area, the geographic range, population range, that will result in the change. So dynamics is sort of the study about how the population is changing over time. And I give you an example. So when we talk about changes over time, we're talking about the number of births and the number of deaths within a given population. If the number of births is larger than the number of deaths, then the size of the population will increase over time. And we could say vice versa with the number of deaths being greater than the number of births. And so it's not this constant idea, or it's this idea that there is this constant interaction with the environment that's changing the population both in size, number, and in geographic range. One important consideration when we're talking about this is generation time. So what do I mean by generation time? Well, generation time is the amount of time from birth or hatch of the individual until that individual is able to produce offspring of its own. And so we would define that as being the generation time. Individuals or organisms with a long generation time tend to have a more stable population, okay? Whereas with short, we can see short generation times show dramatic shifts in shorter periods of time. Okay, it seems obvious. Shown here with our Daphnia, which has a fairly short generation time, you can see over a matter of just days, there is the change in the population dramatically. Okay. So one important consideration when looking at the changes in the population size is going to be generation time. So how do we study populations? Okay. Well, the study of populations can be looked at, first of all, considering the actual curve of that. How do we depict the change in population over time? And so we have two different curves here. Okay, the first one, this red line, is an exponential curve. Okay, and an exponential curve is a population in which there is no limit in growth. Okay, this will show an exponential growth. And so we can define this as change in number. Dn is the change in number of individuals. Over the change in time. Okay? And in this case, it's simply going to be our population factor, in this case it's shown as 1, times n, which is the population size. So if the population size is 2, the next generation will be 4. The next generation will be 8, 16, so on and so forth. And it very quickly grows to a very long one. So exponential growth only occurs in populations in which the population doesn't have a limit. There's no limit on that. The other type of curve, which is probably, I would say, more realistic, is a logistic. Okay? And the logistic curve in this case is representing a population in which there's a maximum number of individuals that can be sustained and maintained in a certain geographic area. And once it reaches that population, that size, which is referred to as the carrying capacity, that means that there's going to be sort of a slowing in the rate of growth, and eventually the number of births, the number of deaths will sort of equate together, and it'll stabilize the population. So this gives you an example of the two curves, okay? And so we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the logistic curve, okay? Before we do that, one quick note about the exponential growth. As I mentioned, there is no limit on the population size. It continues to increase exponentially over time. However, if we change the rate of death, then we're going to see a slowing in the ability to get there. So it'll take longer to reach sort of this exponential growth state. Okay? So the first curve here shows a division every 30 minutes. And so it shows the typical exponential curve. The second curve here says that there's a division still every 30 minutes, but 25% of the population dies in each generation. So we're still in an exponential curve. There's no limit in the ability or in the growth of the population, but in this case, we see that it takes longer until it reaches this dramatic increase. Okay, so logistic curve. So the first thing I want to talk about with the logistic curve is the different parts. Okay, so a logistic curve represents most normal populations. Okay? There's going to be some limited resource. There's only so many bacteria that are able to grow in a flask. There's only so many deer that can be supported in a forest. There's only so many snakes that can be on a plane. In each case, there's going to be some limiting resource. Okay? It may be food or water if you're an animal. Okay? It may be sunlight. If you get too much overgrowth, that could limit plant growth. In every case we're talking about here, there is some limitation, and so that limitation is going to end up slowing the curve. So we see three different phases in a logistic growth curve. The first is exponential growth. So when a new population is introduced into an area, there are no limitations on its ability to reproduce, its ability to find food or other resources. And so initially it's going to be just an exponential growth. Over time, one or more of the resources becomes limiting, so we see a slowing in the growth. And so the slowing, we begin to see a reduction in the growth. And finally, we reach this plateau where there's no further growth in the population. In other words, the rate of death equals the rate of birth. And so when we talk about this curve, we can describe these as being these equations. Again, change over number over the change in time. Okay? And that's going to equal the factor here, just consider that a constant, times the population size. Again, for exponential, that's all that we have to consider. Okay? In this case only, we have an additional factor, which we usually define as K. Okay? And K is the carrying capacity. For the population demonstrated here, 1,000 is the carrying capacity, so we substitute in 1,000 there. And so what happens is we see a slowing or a reduction in the growth. Now, one of the ways I like to think of this is we can think of this as a percent of carrying capacity. And the higher or the closer we are to the carrying capacity, okay, once we reach 1,000, this will be 0, okay, and so therefore 0 times whatever the population is times 1, that means there's going to be no population growth. In some cases, we'll see early in their curve, so if we come in here and we say we're right here where the population or the population size is 950, then that would give us 1,000 minus 950 divided by 1,000, which will equal 0.05. Okay? And so when we reach this point, you can see the population growth has already dramatically begun to slow. Okay? If we come down further, let's say we're at 50 instead of 950, that would equal 0.95. So therefore we could say the population growth is 95% of the potential exponential growth. And so we can go anywhere in there. The point is, this correction factor here, okay, is going to allow, yeah, that's the correction factor there again, okay, is going to allow us to determine how close we are to the carrying capacity. And here I give you a definition of those. Again, this constant that I mentioned before is reproductive rate. How do we define reproductive rate? Well, it's the number of new individuals minus the number that leave or die, number of births minus the number of deaths. But we also have to consider individuals moving into that population. Number of immigration, moving in, minus the number of emigrating, the number moving out of the population. So over time, we will see the value gets closer and closer to the carrying capacity. This factor gets smaller and smaller, and so therefore our rate is adjusted according to how close we are to the carrying capacity. Okay? A couple of real-world examples. Okay? So we're using two examples. We have the number of fur seals over time and the number of, okay, I know it gives that term. I'm going to call it Daphnia. You guys are all familiar with the Daphnia, and I think it's a good example here. Notice what happens, okay, is that we are moving, in the case of the fur seals, long generation time. So it began as exponential, and then it starts slowing as we get closer and closer to the carrying capacity. And eventually the birth rate and the death rate are about equal, and so the number of individuals remains fairly constant. Now, I think an important note here is that it's not always a perfect fit. And so in the case of the Daphnia here, you can see our population begins to increase and it grows exponentially for a long time. As it gets closer, we do sort of see a decrease, but in this case, it actually overshot. It's growing faster than the adjustment can occur. And so we end up with a short period of a negative growth rate in which the number of deaths or the number of emigrations is larger than the number of births or the number of immigration, and so therefore we have a negative growth curve. And that's going to then cause this negative growth to sort of level out over time. And you can see here we've reached a carrying capacity somewhere about, let's say, 275 to 300 in this particular geographic area. Okay. And so I'm going to stop this video here. We'll come back and reconsider the logistic curve and look at some of the other possibilities as far as regulating carrying capacity. Thank you for watching this video. If you have questions, please post them on the discussion board on Schoology. And we will continue forward with a little bit more population ecology in the next video. Thank you.